You have probably heard about medieval feudalism, but do you really know what it was? And if you were to describe it in one sentence, what would you say? Today we are talking about feudalism, which might sound like a fancy restaurant in France, but instead is actually a way of organizing society. We can find the origins of European feudalism in the early medieval period after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. As we saw last time, many of the former Roman provinces were now independent states run by local elites, who had managed to preserve some elements of Roman rule while also changing others to fit their own cultures and circumstances. Over time, this led to the creation of noble dynasties, families whose status and wealth were maintained across generations. Part of the answer lies in the nature of the relationship between the king and his nobles. Since the king couldn't directly manage his lands, he relied on the nobles to do it for him. Remember, feudalism was a system of reciprocal obligations. Feudalism wasn't only about land ownership and military service. The lord was not only the owner of the land, but also the head of the local community. In some areas, such as Italy and France, merchant activity flourished, leading to the development of commercial capitalism. Feudalism was a system of reciprocal obligations among members of society that emerged in medieval Europe as a means of organizing power and authority in the absence of a strong central government. So make sure you subscribe so you don't miss out. Thanks for watching this episode of Crash Course Medieval World History, which was filmed at the Team Sandoval Pier studio and made with the help of all these nice people. It was based on the ownership of land and the right to use it in exchange for military service and other forms of assistance. Feudalism was also closely linked to the manorial system, which was the typical economic organization of landed estates in medieval Europe. It created a hierarchical society in which the king was at the top, followed by the nobility and the peasantry. However, the relationship between these groups was not static, but rather fluid and dynamic, shaped by a variety of factors, including the relative power and influence of the groups, the availability of resources, and the changing needs of the kingdom. In fact, feudalism wasn't really a system at all, but rather a set of customs, traditions and relationships that defined the rights and obligations of different groups in medieval society. It was most fully realized in France and England, though similar systems existed throughout medieval Europe and even in Japan. He was responsible for the justice and well-being of his subjects and was expected to protect them from external threats. The peasants, meanwhile, were expected to be loyal to their lord and to respect his authority. The relationship between the lord and his subjects was based on a system of patronage and clientelism, in which the lord provided protection and assistance to his subjects in exchange for their loyalty and support. It also had significant economic and social dimensions. For example, one of the key features of feudalism was the relationship between the nobility and the peasantry. The vast majority of people in medieval Europe were farmers who lived on the land owned by the nobility. They were not allowed to own the land themselves. They were allowed to farm it under the condition that they paid rent to their landlord in the form of labor, goods, or money. This arrangement is known as a manorial system, which was the typical economic organization of landed estates in medieval Europe. Manors were self-sufficient communities that consisted of the lord's residence, the peasant's village, the farmland, forests, and other resources necessary for the community to sustain itself. Peasants were tied to the land and were required to work on the lord's estate for a certain number of days each week, in exchange for the right to farm a portion of the land for themselves. They were also expected to pay a portion of their crops to their lord as rent, and to provide other forms of labor, such as building and repairing the lord's buildings, or working in his fields during harvest time. The system of labor and rent was essential to the functioning of the medieval economy, and it ensured that the nobility had a reliable source of income, and that the peasants had access to the land they needed to survive. While the king granted land to his nobles in exchange for their loyalty and service, the nobles in turn owed military service and other forms of assistance to the king. Similarly, the nobles who received land from their lords owed the same kind of loyalty and service back to them. This meant that the king was not all-powerful and had to maintain a delicate balance of power among the various members of the nobility to keep them loyal and content. The nobles, in turn, relied on the king's authority to protect their lands. Thus, both parties had an interest in maintaining the relationship. The king was dependent on his nobles to govern and collect taxes from their domains, to provide soldiers for his army, and to advise him on matters of policy. Nobles, meanwhile, depended on the king for protection against external threats and for recognition and legitimization of their own authority over their own subjects. This mutual dependence helped to create a system of checks and balances in which neither the king nor the nobles could accumulate too much power without disrupting the relationship and risking losing their respective positions. Kings preferred to give land to relatives or close advisors, but sometimes they granted land to whoever could best help them manage their domain. For example, the Counts of Toulouse, a position created by King Clovis in the late 5th century to defend his northern border, originally non-nobles who had gained their status through their service. Over time, however, their service became hereditary, turning them into nobles. In other words, being born into a certain social class became the primary method of achieving nobility. As a result, kings didn't necessarily have the power to enforce laws across their entire territories. And with the absence of a strong central authority, local lords became increasingly powerful. They promoted tournaments where nobles could practice combat while showcasing their skills and prowess. They established courts where nobles were expected to behave in a certain manner and follow strict rules of etiquette. And they encouraged the writing of epic poems and romances that celebrated the deeds of loyal knights and the importance of following one's lord. All of this was part of a broader effort to shape the culture of the nobility in a way that was favorable to the king and the kingdom. Now, these local lords weren't kings, so they needed a system to justify their authority. Enter feudalism. Well, how about this? Feudalism was a combination of legal, economic, and political customs and practices that defined the relationship between landowners and their tenants from the 9th to the 15th century in Europe. Not bad, but wait, there's more to it than that. In fact, we're going to need to talk about the origins of the system, its role in society, and even some of its major differences with other similar systems, such as manorialism. So buckle up your chins, because here at Crash Course, we're going medieval. It's me, and this is Crash Course Medieval World History. Feudalism emerged in the context of decentralized kingdoms in post-Roman Europe. It was not a centralized institution like the Roman state, nor was it imposed by any particular ruler or government. But it's probably more accurate to think of it as a series of interlocking pieces, each with different functions. Let's start at the top with the king. The king owned all the land in the kingdom. However, he rarely, if ever, lived in the countryside and directly managed his lands. So he would grant portions of his lands to members of his court, the nobility, in exchange for their loyalty and service. This practice is called a fief, which is both the land grant itself and the obligation for military service. The size of the fief varied greatly depending on the needs of the realm and the resources of the kingdom. Some fiefs were large enough to be self-sufficient mini-states within the larger kingdom, while others were much smaller. Sometimes nobles could even subdivide their fiefs and grant portions to lesser nobles as long as the total amount did not exceed what they themselves had been granted. These relationships are often depicted in art as a lord receiving land from a king, but this is misleading, since the king didn't typically own his land in this way. He inherited it through family and lineage, just like anyone else. Instead, feudalism was a series of reciprocal obligations among members of society, and it gradually evolved over time through custom and tradition. Let's see how it worked. The structure of feudalism was often represented as a pyramid with the king at the top and the peasants at the bottom. Now, these grants of land were usually hereditary, meaning that when a lord died, his title and estate passed to his heirs. But how did the king ensure that his nobles would remain loyal and obedient? But that's not all. The king also carefully cultivated a culture of courtly love and etiquette that emphasized the importance of loyalty, obedience, and honor among the nobility. However, let's not forget that while the king was at the top of the feudal pyramid, he still had obligations to those below him. Speaking of content, it's time for a quick break. In addition to the economic relationship, the manor also had a social dimension. While the manorial system was the dominant economic and social system in medieval Europe, it wasn't the only one. So let's take a second to summarize everything we've learned about feudalism.